Welcome back, everybody. Today we are continuing our second unit where we talk about specific individual Catholic social teachings. We just finished talking about Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII's encyclical in 1891, where he critiques both communism and unrestricted free market capitalism. Today we're turning our attention to not just voting, but politics in general, how Catholics should think about politics. We're going to talk about voting, but there's some other things dealing with politics that I want to talk about. We'll get into the two texts. I do read two short texts for today, for this week's unit. But before that, I want to give a little bit of historical context, both in sort of the church in general, in particular the Europe, but also the United States, and how the United States, because of our sort of historical background, in many ways it's a Protestant country, also because of the separation of church and state. The United States is very different from Europe. Even till this day, there are some countries that have state-sponsored religions. Germany, I think, has two. Catholic and Lutheran. Certainly the Church of England has the Anglican Church. The country of England has the Church of England, which is state-sponsored. So, we I think in the 21st century often forget, even in Europe, there are still places where the countries have state-sponsored religions. So first I want to just talk about the Catholic Church's general understanding of political forms, right? Certainly in the early church, the church was persecuted for the first 300 years within the Roman Empire. Then the Roman Empire collapses. You have, the rise of the feudal system. You have kings, the monarchies, into the early early modern period. And then you start to have modern nation states. And that includes things like the United States and other. We often call them democracies. Of course, we technically don't live in a democracy, right? We live in a republic. A republic is a form of government where you send somebody, a representative or a senator, to represent you and do the work of politics on your behalf, whereas democracy is the demos, the people actually govern themselves. Now, certainly we have some of that in the United States, especially here in California. Anytime you vote, there are certain ballot measures, and you get to do a direct vote for or against a particular ballot measure. But that's very, small compared to just the general work of the political life of a state or the country. So you have in the United States in particular, but other countries after us, in the early modern period, rise of republics and democracies. And the Catholic Church immediately was not fond of that, not from any specifically theological reasons necessarily, but because of the French Revolution in particular, 1789, and then the sort of violence that continued on afterwards, and then Napoleon, of course. We don't have time to get into the French Revolution, but the Catholic Church then, and frankly to this day in many ways, is still deeply wounded by the French Revolution. The Catholic Church in Europe didn't really care so much about the American Revolution because, first of all, we were way on the other side of the Atlantic. Number two, at the end of the 18th century, there were very few Catholics that were located only in certain parts of the country, like Maryland. It's not until middle of the 19th century and then really exploding in the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century where this country, the United States, starts to get a lot of Catholics. So America just wasn't a big Catholic country at the time. And also the revolution that we had in this country, of course, it was violent, but it wasn't violent directed at the Catholic Church. Whereas in the French Revolution, you absolutely had that. You had nuns and priests and brothers being killed. You had parishes being torn down, violated. The worst that you can think of. The Notre Dame in Paris was taken over by the state. and sort of rechristened as a temple towards reason. So a lot of violence and damage done to the Catholic Church because of the French Revolution. And so really, in some circles till this day, but certainly until Vatican II, the Catholic Church was deeply suspicious of representative forms of government that the Catholic Church sort of held on for a long time with preferring monarchy over representative governments. So the Catholic Church was deeply suspicious of these representative forms of government. And now let's talk momentarily about the relationship between church and state. As I mentioned earlier, to this day, there are countries in Europe where there is state-sponsored religion. That is, the church pays the salary of the local priest in the Church of England, for example. They in the Church of England, what we call Episcopalians in the United States, they have vicars or priests there. So the Europeans did not have a history of the sort of separation of church and state. In the United States, of course, comes along. And I think a lot of Americans today don't fully understand early in the Republic the relationship between church and state. There certainly was never on the federal level, an official church for the United States. That's true. But in the early years of the Republic, individual states did have state-sponsored churches. That dissipated fairly quickly, but that did exist. And so the Catholic Church initially was not favorable with separation of church and state. The idea was, especially as in a country that had a majority of Catholics, those Catholics should push for Catholicism to be the official religion of the state. And if it was a minority of a particular state, then the Catholics should sort of push for religious tolerance. One thing that I've mentioned in my church history class, and we'll get into some of this stuff a little more in detail. For example, the rise of Catholics in the United States. We'll talk about that in the church history class and the anti-Catholicism that has been throughout the United States' history. But one of the things that I talk about in that class is Pope Pius IX, who was the Pope for a very long time in the 19th century. And he had in 1864, what's called the Syllabus of Errors, which is a collection of 80 points from a variety of texts that he had written. So it's sort of a culmination of points, maybe one sentence or two sentences, a small paragraph maybe. And in that Syllabus of Errors, this is actually point 55, he says the church ought to be separated from the state and the state from the church. Now, these points, all 80 points from Pius IX here, are propositions which he rejects, right? That's why it's called the Syllabus of Errors. In other words, he's saying, here's a list of 80 things that are errors that we as Catholics need to reject. So again, he says the church ought to be separated from the state and the state from the church. So he's rejecting that proposition, which in the Enlightenment was a growing assertion. And again, certainly the United States believe that, and there are other European countries that were starting to assert that as well. Again, that was in the 19th century. Shifting now to the Second Vatican Council, which was 1962 to 1965. We get into that in great detail in my church history class, so we're not going to get into details on that now. This is the most recent of the 21 ecumenical councils held in the church. And at the Second Vatican Council, Americans, frankly, were not relevant. In fact, there was very few relevant actors at Vatican II that didn't come from Europe, right? Frankly, even though their church for the previous 500 years had been growing internationally, especially because of the missions like the Jesuits and the Franciscans, Vatican II was still primarily European. So the American bishops and theologians didn't really make much of an impact, with one exception. And that exception was an American Jesuit priest, a theologian named John Courtney Murray, arguably one of the most important, if not the most important, American Catholic theologian in the history of the American Catholic Church. He was extremely influential for the writing it's a short document, Dignitatis Humanae. This is the church's, or Vatican II's document on religious liberty. In that document, there's not an explicit rejection of church and state, so you don't have a sort of 180-degree reversal there. Just think, for example, technically the Vatican is a country. It's the smallest modern nation state today, and its official religion is Catholicism. So obviously they're not outright rejecting the trade relationship between church and state. But in Dignitatis Humanae, you do have a stronger emphasis on sort of individual religious liberty. So let me just read a short passage here from Dignitatis Humanae. A sense of the dignity of the human person has been impressing itself more and more deeply on the consciousness of contemporary man. And the demand is increasingly made that men should act on their own judgment, enjoying and making use of responsible freedom, not driven by coercion, but motivated by a sense of duty. The demand is likewise made that constitutional limits should be set to the powers of government in order that there may be no encroachment on the rightful freedom of a person and associations. This demand for freedom in human society chiefly regards the quest for the values proper to the human spirit. In regards, in the first place, the free exercise of religion in society. The Vatican Council takes careful note of these desires in the minds of men. It proposes to declare them to be greatly in accord with truth and justice. To this end, it searches into the sacred tradition and doctrine of the Church, the treasury out of which the Church continually brings forth new things that are in harmony with the things that are old. One thing to keep in mind, of course, this is 1962 to 1965. This is smack dab in the middle of the Cold War, and you have in Europe and around the world, China, communist regimes which are atheistic, and they, for decades at that point, and would continue, have state suppression of all religions, including Christianity. So I think what you have here is certainly less of a focus or concern on this church-state question, and more of an emphasis on the need for individual people, certainly Catholics, to be able to express their religion, to be able to practice their religion under those totalitarian regimes. But this Dignitatis Humanae does, again, sort of have implications on that larger question of church and state. And so, again, the Catholic Church doesn't repudiate the idea of official state religions, but it does sort of, I guess you could say, swing the pendulum back towards a stronger emphasis on individual rights at practicing and worshiping their religion as they see fit. Let's turn our attention now to the United States in particular. Again, we get into some of the anti-Catholicism and the growth of Catholicism in American Christianity in my church history course. So we'll talk about that in depth later. Let's talk a little bit about politics specifically. Catholics were largely shut out of politics, and it wasn't until 1960 with President Kennedy that you have the first Catholic president, and since then, there's only been one other one, Joe Biden. So in the history of the United States, you've had two Catholic presidents. Going up to Kennedy, there was a sort of systematic effort, as best they could, to shut out Catholics from the political life. There had been other Catholics who had run for president, for example. On major party ticket, the Democratic ticket in 1928 was Al Smith, who was the governor of New York. He ran for president in 1928 and was soundly defeated by Herbert Hoover. Hoover received 440 electoral votes, and Al Smith received 87. Hoover won 40 of at the time, there were only 48 states. So Al Smith was beaten quite soundly. Can't say 100% of that has to do with the fact that he was a Catholic, but certainly a large part of it was. So that's the sort of, I guess you could say, the high water mark, or the most obvious example of anti-Catholicism, specifically in the political life. There was deep suspicion from Protestants in this country about Catholic politicians and Catholics in general. This all started to change in a major way in 1960, as I said, with President Kennedy. Anti-Catholicism in general and in politics certainly hasn't entirely evaporated, but for the most part, people don't vote for or against somebody because they're Catholic. Think, for example, right now the majority of Supreme Court justices are Catholic, although you don't vote for Supreme Court justices. But the idea is, today somebody's Catholic identity really doesn't affect their chances at being successful as an elected official. So that change started with President Kennedy, or at that time Senator Kennedy, and the moment where this happened was just a couple of months before the election in November 1960. A lot of Protestants, including Protestant ministers, Southern Protestant ministers, again, were deeply hesitant to vote for Kennedy. Kennedy, of course, was a Democrat. And at the time, prior to President Johnson, you had what's often called the Solid South. Today, we usually think about the South, Georgia, Alabama, as Republican states, and they certainly were conservative back then. But the Solid South referred to the Democratic Party. That really, since Reconstruction, the South voted solidly for the Democratic Party. Don't forget, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and the Southerners didn't really like Abraham Lincoln. So this is an example, of course, how parties change, right? So from Reconstruction till President Johnson, really the conservatives, certainly in the South, were the Democratic Party, and then they kind of switched. Kennedy's is a Democrat. The Solid South is Democrat, but you have these Protestant ministers. They're like, well, he's our party nominee, but we don't really like him because he's Catholic and he's a Northerner. He's from Boston, right? That didn't help him either. So Kennedy goes down to Houston. He goes to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association invited him to give a speech. You can find this speech on YouTube. You can find everything on YouTube these days, and I encourage you to watch it. It's very short. And he made several points in an attempt to persuade the Houston Protestant ministers to vote for him. Now, whether they actually did or not, who knows? We were not in the voting booths with them. But clearly, Kennedy was elected in 1960. And one of the things that he did, and probably did succeed in easing some of the Protestant minds, is that he is the first Catholic politician, and every Catholic politician in the United States since him has basically made this move. And the move is, I'm going to separate out the sort of spheres of my life. I'm going to silo off my own personal religious beliefs. Senator Kennedy is Catholic. I believe X, Y, and Z. But if I become the president over here, this is my sort of professional life, right? And so I'm not going to bring in my Catholic identity, my Catholic beliefs, my Catholic understanding of morality, or what justice is. I'll keep that to myself, and I will not bring that into the Oval Office. So let me just give you a quick quote here from from Senator Kennedy. He says, I believe in America that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, nor Jewish, where no public official either requests or accepts instructions on public policy from the Pope, the National Council of Churches, or any ecclesiastical source. That's actually important because there were a lot of non-Catholics, and even to this day, there are a lot of non-Catholics who believe that any politician like Kennedy or Biden has a direct line to the Pope, and that the president is just a puppet for the Pope and it just does what the Pope tells him to do. So this was a big concern for non-Catholics at the time, and you still see that sort of pop up on the internet and other places. He continues. He says, where no religious body seeks to impose its will directly or indirectly upon the general populace or the public acts of its officials, and where religious liberty is so indivisible that an act against one church is treated as an act against all. So notice that language of nobody that seeks to impose its will directly or indirectly upon the general populace. Right, general populace. He's hinting at the idea of, not only do we not have every citizen in the United States as Catholic at the time, but we have a pluralistic society. So again, he is privatizing his religion, and every Catholic politician, and probably other politicians as well from other groups, have made that move, have taken that playbook, if you will, from Kennedy and have repeated that in a variety of different ways. You can think of Mayor Mario Cuomo in the 1980s, the New York City mayor. He made this sort of the same general type of move. Joe Biden, again, the second Catholic president, did the same sort of thing throughout, first of all, his vice presidency for 8 years, but then his presidency for 4 years. And you can see this, I think, most clearly in the vice presidential debate against Paul Ryan. The question that was being posed to both men was about abortion. And here's what Biden said at the time. He said, with regard to abortion, I accept my church's position on abortion as what we call de fide doctrine, which I'm not sure honestly what that means. De fide, it means on faith, but I'm not sure what he means by de fide doctrine. But his point is, I, Joe Biden, accept what the church teaches about abortion. Okay? Straightforward enough, I think. He continues. He says, life begins at conception. And he's right. That's what the Catholic Church teaches. That's the church's judgment. I accept it in my personal life. But I refuse to impose it on equally devout Christians and Muslims and Jews. And I just refuse to impose it on others. So notice he's using that word impose there twice, right? When he says others, Muslims, Jews, Christians, again, hinting at the exact same thing that Kennedy was hinting at. We live in a pluralistic society. And so Joe Biden is saying, I believe what the church teaches on abortion, but I am, running for president. He was the vice president. He later became the president. And I'm not going to impose the church's position on abortion, on a population that is not fully Catholic, because we've got a lot of different groups here. So perfect example of this sort of privatizing of religion. You've got the private beliefs of the politician and the public behavior, and by that I mean policy making that affects, hundreds of millions of people. So Kennedy started that playbook, and every Catholic politician since him has followed that playbook. Which brings us to the first of the two documents that I had you read for this week. The first one's called Doctrinal Note on Some questions regarding the participation in Catholics in political life. This was written by at the time it's called the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. It's now called the DDF, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. At the time, the prefect of the CDF was Joseph Ratzinger, who later on gets a name that's more familiar to most people, and that name is Pope Benedict XVI. So Ratzinger, being the prefect, certainly didn't write every word of this word for word. It's, there's a whole congregation of people helping him. But anytime you read these documents that were when Ratzinger was the prefect, you get a clear, if you've read other work from Ratzinger, his stamp of his writing style and thought is on this document. So there's a couple things I want to talk about in this that's in this document that you read, and is directly connected to what we were just saying, in particular about Kennedy and Biden and Catholic politicians. So let's just read. This is section 1, so about halfway down through section 1. He says, by fulfilling their civic duties, guided by a Christian conscience, in conformity with its values, the lay faithful, so he's not talking here specifically about politicians, but he's talking about all of us, you and me, we exercise their proper task of infusing the temporal order with Christian values, all the while respecting the nature and rightful autonomy of that order, and cooperating with other citizens according to their particular competence and responsibility. The consequence of this fundamental teaching of the Second Vatican Council is that the lay faithful are never to relinquish their participation in public life. That is, in many different economic, social, legislative, administrative, and cultural areas which are intended to promote organically and institutionally the common good. This would include the promotion and defense of goods such as public order and peace, freedom and equality, respect for human life and the environment, justice and solidarity. So what is he saying here? He's saying, first of all, lay Catholics, all of us need to participate, yes, in politics in the sense of voting, but just the political life in general. So meaning that in the broadest sense. And you can see this really contrasting with other Christian groups, like think of the Amish. The Amish don't run for political office, but they also don't do other things, like they don't vote. They don't join the army, right? They don't participate in society. Like they won't have... They won't participate in insurance companies, that if you need some type of medical insurance or housing insurance or something like that, they themselves, the Amish community, provide that. So they basically say, we, the Amish, have our community, the world out there, which they call the English, right? The English is anybody who's not Amish. That's their world, and there's this sort of strict divide, and the Amish aren't going to participate in that. Here you see a Catholic way of thinking, which is Catholics need and can participate in all spheres of life. So yes, you can run for office, but you can also join the military. You can work for insurance companies. You can get insurance, that type of thing. But also, so that's the general point. Then the more specific point in the middle of what I read there, that the lay faithful exercise their proper task of infusing the temporal order with Christian values. Again, that can certainly mean, run for office and try to pass legislation. But that also means that you and I as Catholics, since I'm not a politician and you're probably not a politician, that you don't divide the sectors of your life by saying, okay, I'm going to be a Catholic on Sunday, but on Tuesday when I go to the voting booth and I vote for the president, I'm going to leave my religion at the door. No, says Ratzinger, that you have to infuse all the order. That means you take your religious values into the voting booth, but it also means just, into your cubicle at work, for example. Catholics in America in the 21st century, if they work in a secular space, they get very skittish about that. They say, oh, I can't show my religion at all, even just putting up a crucifix in my cubicle or something like that. So you have this divide between both. the sort of public and the private sphere. And Ratzinger is saying, no, we need to collapse those walls between these spheres of our lives, and because we are Catholic. I've said this before. The word Catholic comes from the Greek compound kataholos, which means according to the whole, right? So in this case, meaning you're not going to divide out the spheres of your life, of your voting in the voting booth, and then on Sunday going to Mass and having a sort of wall between those. But even more on a sort of day-to-day level, when he says that Christians need to infuse the temporal order with Christian values, that means in all things, right? What are our values? Well, just think of the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes, right? Those values that Jesus preached there. So just when you're walking down the street, that you should be infusing your behavior and in this sort of secular world that we live in with these Christian values. So Ratzinger's point here is we should not put up these walls. We should not divide these spheres of our lives. That our Christian values should pervade all the spheres of our lives, not just our private lives on Sunday morning. Now, Ratzinger, this is section 6, talks specifically about politicians, right? And what you're going to see here is he doesn't mention Kennedy or this was written before Biden or any individual politician, but he clearly has them in mind. Ratzinger's a smart guy. He knew what was going on, certainly in the United States, but elsewhere, seeing what Catholic politicians were doing by taking that Kennedy playbook. So here he says, the appeal often made to the rightful autonomy of the participation of lay Catholics in politics needs to be clarified. Promoting the common good of society, according to one's conscience, has nothing to do with confessionalism or religious intolerance. For Catholic moral doctrine, the rightful autonomy of the political or civil sphere from that of of religion and the church, but not from that of morality, is a value that has been attained and recognized by the Catholic Church and belongs to the inheritance of contemporary civilization. All right, what's he saying here? He's saying, okay, getting back to that earlier point we talked about, that the Catholic Church is not is okay with separation of church and state like you have here in the United States. So you can have a separation of the political sphere from religion, he says, but not from morality, right? You can't divide out, you can divide out church and state, but you can't divide out state and morality. So getting back to that example from Biden that I gave, he was talking, of course, about abortion. He was saying, Vice President Biden, am not going to impose the question, a Catholic view of abortion onto the country because the country is not entirely Catholic. What Ratzinger is saying is, no, Biden, you're making a mistake. The mistake that you're making is saying that abortion is a uniquely or specifically Catholic doctrinal issue, like God is one and Trinitarian, Jesus is human and divine. What he's saying is the question of abortion is not a doctrinal issue in the sense of a specifically Christian doctrine, but is a moral issue. Abortion is a moral issue which touches on people who are not Catholic. So in other words, he's saying, yes, it's okay for a state not to pass laws that dictate, for example, that you have to go to church on Sundays, or that you have to tithe a certain amount of money to your church, or anything is specifically related uniquely to a Catholic doctrine. Like, it's okay that the state doesn't pass a law that you must believe in the Trinity, right? That's fine. But the question of abortion is a moral issue. It's not a doctrinal issue in that sort of narrowly Christian sense. And so Ratzinger is saying you can't play that Joe Biden card. You can't play that Kennedy card. Say, well, I'm not going to impose my Catholic view of abortion on non-Catholic citizens, because Ratzinger is saying abortion is not a uniquely or specifically Catholic doctrinal issue. It's a moral issue. And again, you'll get into abortion in your moral theology class, so we're not going to talk about that here. But there's nothing uniquely or specifically Catholic about being against abortion, right? There are Jews against abortion, atheists who are against abortion, rationalists who are against abortion. There's nothing unique about abortion in the sense that, our vision of the Pope as the head of the church, that's sort of uniquely Catholic. So Ratzinger is critiquing Biden and Kennedy and people like him and saying, you're making a fundamentally an intellectual mistake by confusing your categories. You need to make distinctions between your categories. What are the things that are uniquely or specifically Catholic, like the Pope or Immaculate Conception or something like that, and other things which, yes, we Catholics believe, like being against abortion, but that's not uniquely or specifically Catholic. And so Ratzinger is calling out, he's critiquing that whole playbook and saying, no, you can't do that. You can't divide out the spheres of your life and saying, I'm going to keep this personal to myself, and in my role as president or vice president, I'm going to do something different. So Ratzinger is saying that move is not a Catholic move. All right, I want to move now to the second document that you were required to read for this week. This was not written by the Vatican like the first document, but was written by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, so our U.S. bishops. So, of course, keep in mind that what does that mean? That means, well, these bishops, as Americans, participate in the same political life, and as Americans, they have pretty much the same assumptions about, our republic and representative governments, as opposed to somebody who comes from a country that doesn't have that same background that we have. So let's keep that in mind. This document, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, I should say, it came out years ago, and it's been revised usually every 4 years, about a year before the presidential election. The revisions generally aren't major. It might be an added line or so. I remember when shortly after Pope Francis became the Pope and his agenda started to become a little bit clearer, like things, about the environment, for example. I did a close study of the version of this document before and after Pope Francis became the Pope, and there's clearly a couple of clauses that were added to the document that sort of emphasize Pope Francis's vision. But for the most part, this document, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, in its entirety is pretty much the same as it was from the beginning. So this question, this document is examining the question of being a citizen of the United States, but a faithful citizen, right? So faithful meaning a Catholic citizen. So in the title of the text itself is sort of posing that question for you, which is, how can you be a good American citizen and a good Catholic? Is that possible? And in particular, it's going to get to this question of voting. How do you vote? And in particular, the tough thing, because of the reality of our country, even though it's not necessary, but the reality of our country is we have a two-party system. And if you just pay any attention to politics, you know that even though these parties shift, as I was already mentioning earlier, there's never, no matter what configuration of these two parties have been, there has never been a party that perfectly matched with Catholic moral and social teaching. And so the question is left for every Catholic every 2 to 4 years is, how do I vote? How do I vote for a politician? You have maybe two, or even in the primaries, you have half dozen politicians running for an office, and you ask yourself, well, how do I do this? How do I vote for these people who don't perfectly match in their moral and social vision what we Catholics have? So how do you wrestle with that very difficult topic? We're going to talk about this in our Zoom class. We don't have time to go through everything here in this lecture, but there's a couple of points that I want to draw your attention to. All right, so I want to begin by talking about the question, what are the things that we as Catholics should prioritize when we think about voting for a particular candidate? This is sections 21, 22, and 23. And what we're going to see here is that we as Catholics must prioritize certain issues over others, right? And we can't just sort of choose what issues that we personally are interested in. So, for example, I'm a Catholic educator. I not only do I teach, but I read and write about education. I think about education. I think about our public and Catholic school systems all the time, and think about how can we make education better. So I might be tempted to say, well, I'm an educator, so I'm going to look at the education policies of these different candidates, and I'm going to vote based on their policies that they're proposing for education. Now, what the U.S. bishops are going to say is, well, you don't have to necessarily ignore their education policies, but there are certain issues that must be prioritized. So you can't prioritize education. You also, as you'll see here in just a second, it's going to say you can't prioritize things like tax policy. This is something Americans often will vote for. They'll vote the pocketbook, right? In terms of like, I want to vote for the person who's going to, cut my taxes. And there's a lot of Catholics out there who will say, that I'm a one issue voter, and that's the one I'm going to vote for. Again, there's nothing wrong with considering tax policy. That is important. Our pocketbooks are important. But what you're going to see here is that the bishops say the umbrella of issues that we need to prioritize over other things like tax policy or education policy are those issues which are directly tied to the dignity of the human person. Right? Getting back to that thing that we've been talking about all semester, the dignity of the human person. Certainly, education and tax policy do touch on those. I'm not saying that they don't, but that they are indirectly or secondarily related to the dignity of the human person. So let's see here in sections 21, 22, and 23, what do the bishops say are the issues that we need to prioritize in terms of the issues of the dignity of the human person as created in the image and likeness of God. Aided by the virtue of prudence and the exercise of well-formed consciences, Catholics are called to make practical judgments regarding good and evil choices in the political arena. There are some things we must never do as individuals or as a society because they are always incompatible with love of God and neighbor. Such actions are so deeply flawed that they are always opposed to the authentic good of persons. These are called intrinsically evil actions. They must always be rejected and opposed and must never be supported and condoned. A prime example is the intentional taking of innocent life, as in abortion and euthanasia. In our nation, abortion and euthanasia have become preeminent threats to human dignity because they directly attack life itself, the most fundamental human good and the condition for all others. It is a mistake with grave moral consequences to treat the destruction of innocent human life merely as a matter of individual choice. A legal system that violates the basic right to life on the grounds of choice is fundamentally flawed. I want to unpack that term that's used in the document, intrinsically evil acts. An evil act, first of all, is an act, it's evil because it lacks goodness. It lacks goodness, right? And what does that mean? It's an action which is not ordered towards love of neighbor, it's ordered towards myself, right? So, the classic example that evil always turns to, of course, is Hitler. Why were Hitler's actions evil? Well, because they weren't actions ordered towards the good. They weren't ordered towards love of God and neighbor. They were ordered towards inward, towards himself, right? I, Hitler, have a vision of Europe, and I'm going to do what I can to impose my vision on Europe. And oh, by the way, that vision does not include Jews, right? So his actions were evil because they were not, they lacked goodness, and because they were not ordered towards love of God and neighbor. Now, what about that other word, intrinsically? Intrinsically means in the very nature of doing the thing, right? So an intrinsically evil action is in the very nature of doing the thing that action is evil, as opposed to other actions which might be evil or morally blameworthy, but are blameworthy depending on particular context. So for example, if I'm dancing with a woman and I step on her toe and I break her pinky toe, is that morally blameworthy? Is that an evil action? And the answer is, well, it depends. Am I just a bad dancer? If that's the case, well, that's not an intrinsically evil action. My intention was not to hurt this woman. I'm just a bad dancer and I accidentally broke her toe. However, if she's my girlfriend and we've gotten into a fight earlier that day and I'm still mad at her and I want to hurt her and I slam my foot down on her while we're dancing and I break her toe, well, yes, that is a morally blameworthy action. It is an action which lacks goodness. It is not an act of love ordered towards my neighbor. So in that context, in that situation, then yes, that would be an evil act. That would be a morally blameworthy act. So there are some actions which are evil based on context, situation, intention, right? Did I intend to hurt her or did I not intend to hurt her? Other actions, and these are the intrinsically evil actions, they're evil, they're morally blameworthy, they lack goodness just in the act of doing them. You could have the greatest intention of all time, but it doesn't matter. In doing the action, you are committing an evil. And what are those? Well, again, actions which offend against the dignity of the human person. Let's keep reading here. This is section 23, and he's going to sort of list out, or they are going to list out some of these intrinsically evil actions. Similarly, so I already mentioned abortion and euthanasia, and the list continues. Similarly, human cloning, destructive research on human embryos, and other acts that directly violate the sanctity and dignity of human life, there's that word, are also intrinsically evil. They must always be opposed. Other direct assaults on human innocent life, such as genocide, torture, and the targeting of non-combatants in acts of terror or war, can never be justified. Nor can violations of human dignity, such as acts of racism, treating workers as mere means to an end, deliberately subjecting workers to subhuman living conditions, treating the poor as disposable, or redefining marriage to deny its essential meaning ever be justified. So I think you have in those three sections there, I think the list is 12 different articulated intrinsically evil acts. This does not mean that the list of intrinsically evil acts is only 12. As I mentioned, this document is sometimes updated. So for example, that very last one, redefining marriage to deny its essential meaning, that was added into the document right around the time of the Obergefell v. Hodges Supreme Court case 2015. That's the Supreme Court case that federally allows homosexual marriage, of redefining marriage. In fact, what the text says is you can define marriage any way you want to do, okay? So 12 listed here, that doesn't mean that's all the entire list of intrinsically evil acts. But again, the point here is this is what needs to take priority when we think about voting. The actions that offend against the dignity of the human person, not things like tax policy or education policy. So if this is saying that we can never participate in intrinsically evil actions, that obviously brings up the next question, which is, okay, can we as Catholic voters vote for somebody who does support an intrinsically evil action, right? So we saw, for example, one of the 12 listed here of an intrinsically evil action is human cloning. So one question that we have to ask ourselves is, well, all right, well, what if there's a candidate and I like this candidate and I want to vote for this candidate, but this candidate, part of his or her policy platform is to support human cloning. Can I, as a Catholic voter, vote for that person? important question. The answer we can see here on section 34 and 35, and I think this is arguably the most important section of this entire, or two sections of this entire document, because it gets to this question about voting for candidates who do not have a perfectly Catholic moral and social vision. That certainly would include non-Catholic politicians, but these days, frankly, how many Catholic politicians even have moral and social beliefs that are perfectly in line with Catholic social and moral teaching? So this is often where you hear the phrase that, Catholics are sort of homeless voters, right? They don't feel at home with either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. Let's read these two sections, 34 and 35, and see what does it say about that question. Can I vote for somebody who supports an intrinsically evil act like human cloning, for example? Catholics often face difficult choices about how to vote. This is why it is so important to vote according to a well-formed conscience and perceives the proper relationship among moral goods. A Catholic cannot vote for a candidate who favors a policy promoting an intrinsically evil act, such as, and then you get a list again, abortion, euthanasia, assisted suicide, deliberately subjecting workers to the poor, to subhuman living conditions, redefining marriage in ways that violate its essential meaning or racist behavior, if the voter's intent is to support that position. In such cases, a Catholic would be found guilty of formal cooperation in grave evil. At the same time, a voter should not use a candidate's opposition to an intrinsic evil to justify indifference or inattentiveness to other important moral issues involving human life and dignity. There may be times when a Catholic who rejects a candidate's unacceptable position, even on policies promoting an intrinsically evil act, may responsibly decide for that candidate for other morally grave reasons. Voting in this way would be permissible only for truly grave moral reasons, not to advance narrow interests or partisan preferences, or to ignore a fundamental moral evil. All right, what is this saying? This is saying you cannot vote for a candidate who supports a morally intrinsically evil action. And then here's the key phrase out of the entire document. If the voter's intent, there's that word intention, if the voter's intent is to support that position. What does that mean? That means at the heart of all of this really isn't about the politician. What is his or her voting platform? At the end of the day, what this is about is you, the voter. What is your intention? Yes, the policy platforms of the politicians are important, but ultimately what is important is the voter's intention. Do you intend to support that policy? You say, I'm going to vote for this woman because she is in favor of human cloning, which is a morally intrinsically evil action. If the answer is yes, you're voting for that woman because you're intending to vote for her because she supports human cloning, then you are, again, as it says, formally cooperating in a grave evil, and you should go to confession. But it says, section 35, that you may reasonably decide to vote for that candidate for other morally grave reasons, and you're not intending to vote to support that woman. So let's say that candidate, this hypothetical candidate, yes, she supports human cloning, but let's say she is opposed to abortion, and that's the thing that she's really campaigning on, right? This is another thing you have to pay attention to. You can go to a politician's website and you can say, here's, the 50 policy positions, but some policy positions are number 1 and some policy positions are number 50. And let's say this hypothetical female candidate, her number 50 issue is human cloning. It's on her policy website, but she doesn't really care about it, and she's not going to be pushing for human cloning. But let's say her number 1 issue is she's anti-abortion. So you can vote for her because you're supporting her anti-abortion policy, but yes, she has a pro-human cloning policy, but that's not your intention. Your intention is not to support that part of her policy. Your intention is to support her anti-abortion policy. So again, I think our public discourse when it comes to voting, and in particular Catholics, but just in general in America, we obsessively get caught up on what is the policy position of this candidate or another candidate. And that is important. But what the document is saying is what is more important is the intention. What are you, the voter, intending to support? Just a couple of more points from this document. We'll have plenty to talk about in our discussions in class. But one question we have to ask is, well, what happens if we have one or two candidates and we just can't bring ourselves to sort of vote for one or the other? What do we do in that situation when it's not just a sort of basic issue like cloning, but it gets more complicated than that? So let's read. This is sections 36 and 37. 36. When all candidates hold a position that promote an intrinsically evil act, the conscientious voter faces a dilemma. The voter may decide to take the extraordinary step of not voting for any candidate, or after careful deliberation, may decide to vote for the candidate deemed less likely to advance such a morally flawed position and more likely to pursue other authentic human goods. In making these decisions, it is essential for Catholics to be guided by a well-formed conscience that recognizes that all issues do not carry the same moral weight and that the moral obligation to oppose policies promoting intrinsically evil acts has a special claim on our conscience and our actions. These decisions should take into account a candidate's commitments, character, integrity, and ability to influence a given issue. In the end, this is a decision to be made by each Catholic guided by a conscience formed by Catholic moral teaching. All right, a couple of points here. This is saying you're not required to vote. They are Americans again, and so they believe, as pretty much all Americans, that people have died for this right that we have, that a lot of people around the world to this day do not have, and we should not take this decision lightly. But it is acceptable, they're saying again, in extraordinary circumstances, right? An extraordinary step of not voting for any candidate. If you've got two or more candidates and you look at their positions, and it's not just a simple issue of, one intrinsically evil act like human cloning, but maybe you got two candidates and both of these candidates support 3 or 4 or 5 intrinsically evil acts, and you just can't vote for a candidate. It is acceptable not to vote, but again, they emphasize this idea that it should be an extraordinary step. This is not a sort of invitation just to get lazy and say, I'm going to quit voting altogether, or it's raining out, so I don't want to go to the voting booth, right? That the rule should be, yes, you should participate, you should engage, you should vote, but in those rare circumstances, you can and should vote. Notice also towards the end of that section, it does say that these decisions should take into account a candidate's commitments, character, and integrity. This is something, I'm old enough to remember, the claims against Bill Clinton after he got caught, having a sexual affair with his intern. I'm not going to weigh in here in terms about his impeachment or any of that. I'm simply bringing that up to say that I remember it wasn't that long ago in the 1990s that people were talking about the character of our presidents. And these days, in the 21st century, that seems to be less of an issue, that when people go into the voting booths, that we've become obsessed with only thinking about policy positions. Notice if you read this whole document from beginning to end, it does clearly emphasize policy positions, and again, more importantly, the intention of the voter. But we shouldn't run past the fact that here in section 37, it also says that making it more complicated for us as voters, that we do need to consider their character and we do need to consider their integrity, that those are things that we need to consider. There's one political commentator today, I won't mention his name, he's very quite popular, and he basically says, I don't like this particular candidate, but I had voted for this particular candidate because this candidate, the office of the president, no matter who it is a plumber, right? And if you have a plumbing issue, you hire your plumber to come fix your plumbing issue, and it doesn't matter what his moral stances are. You just need him to fix your plumbing. From this document's perspective, that might be true about your plumber, but we're not talking about plumbers. We're talking about representatives of who we as a people are in political office. So we can't just take that, he or she is just a plumber perspective, that we do need to factor in character and integrity. One final issue to talk about here in the lecture. We'll have plenty of time to talk about this in our conversations on Zoom. And this is about how many sort of issues should we consider. We already saw there were, listed, there were 12 intrinsically evil actions that need to be considered. Again, those are not all the intrinsically evil actions possible. So what do we do with this fact that there are a variety of different issues? I've also talked about education policy and tax policy. So there are a lot of issues out there. How do we think about that fact? In addition to simply, as I mentioned earlier, we must prioritize those issues which directly related to the issues of the dignity of the human person. This is section 42, which says, as Catholics, we are not single-issue voters. A candidate's position on a single issue is not sufficient to guarantee a voter's support. Yet, if a candidate's position on a single issue promotes an intrinsically evil act, such as legal abortion, redefining marriage in a way that denies its essential meaning, or racist behavior, a voter may legitimately disqualify a candidate from receiving support. So what is that saying? Again, the very first line says it, that we are not single-issue voters. And I hear a lot of Catholics say this, and Catholics aren't the only ones who say this, but they'll say, I am a one-issue voter. And usually that one issue is abortion. We've already talked earlier in this document that clearly the bishops say you have to consider abortion and all those other intrinsically evil actions when you're thinking about voting. So they're not saying don't think about it. But they're also here in section 42 saying we are not a single issue voting people. So in other words, you cannot just say, I'm not going to consider anything about these politicians. I'm not going to consider their integrity or their character or any of these other issues. I'm just going to spend 30 seconds looking up to see what is it they have done in the past, or what have they said about abortion or any other single issue that a particular Catholic has in mind. And I'm only going to vote on that one issue. The U.S. bishops right here are rejecting that idea. Look, life is complicated, life is messy, life has many, many issues, not just one issue. And it's hard. We got to get into the voting booth and we need to consider all of these. And as we saw in that previous section, yes, maybe in the extraordinary step, you feel that you can't vote for anybody. You probably should go ahead and maybe vote for those down ballot issues, right? Go ahead and vote for, water commissioner or whatever. So if you're considering the president, you don't want to vote for the president. Okay, extraordinary circumstances dictates that might be the case, but you should be voting down ballot issues. But look, life is complicated, and they're saying you can't just be that single issue voter. You've got to take this seriously. You got to get into the difficulty, the complexity of it all, and don't be lazy and just say, well, I'm just going to pick this one issue that's important to me as a Catholic, and I'm only going to vote on that one issue. The bishops are saying that's not going to cut it. We are not a single issue voting people. All right. Again, that's not the entirety of what these documents say about voting or even just political life in general. We'll get into this in our discussions in class.